Hey, welcome to the Babylonian. This season of the Babylonian, we're going to be exploring the New Testament Apocrypha. I'm Peter, and I'm going to be the co-host in this season. If you want to go ahead and follow our discussion, there's going to be notes and summaries at thebabylonian.com, which you can find in the description. With that being said, with sages, scholars, and the scriptures, let's Bible on.
Greetings, fellow Babylonians. We are back in the land of Babylonia. Peter, how are you?
Doing excellent today. It's a fine Babylonian day. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. Yeah, in this Babylonian time zone, still readjusting, but in fact, we're readjusting to a new type of gospel, apocryphal gospel today. We have been going over infancy gospels, then we moved over to passion and ministry gospels. And now, well, we're not necessarily going to move away from the subject of the passion in Jesus's ministry. We're going to move over to a very specific type of gospel, of apocryphal gospel, called the Pilate cycle. So these are narratives about Pilate and Jesus' suffering under him. There's a lot of overlap between them, but again, they disagree, just like a bunch of the Apocrypha, just in general. There are definitely similar sources for many of the traditions, but that doesn't make it unified. And many of these texts are going to be stitched together by later authors, as we're going to see with the first example of what we're going to go over today. But the cycle just refers to the type of text that focuses on Pilate. So all of these texts are going to have in common that it's specifically focused on stories with Jesus and Pilate. And this is something especially big with the Coptic Church. The Coptic Church really liked Pilate for some reason. I would be interested to know why. We will see how they kind of portray Pilate, which is, to me, very interesting. But a lot of these are Coptic. The Coptic people just had a thing for Pilate. So yeah, the first of these that we're going to go over is called the Acts of Pontius Pilate. And this is actually a composite text. So there's really two parts to it. So the first part of it actually does deal with Pilate, and then the other part really doesn't have anything to do. It could totally exist on its own, but a later author has taken another story that was written totally separately and then tagged it on to the end of that story and made it one, if that makes sense. It's a composite. It's what we would call a composite text. So yeah, just from my perspective, and I don't know if you have anything to add on to this, it seems like, if anything, Pilate is portrayed as the archetypal compromised politician. I think when I was reading Karl Barth's, he has like this short little book called Dogmatics and Outline, where it's just a bunch of lectures he gave on different parts of the Apostles' Creed. And he notes how there are two humans other than Jesus who are named in it. And that's the Virgin Mary and Pontius Pilate. And these are kind of set up against each other as the Virgin Mary on the one hand, who's this poor and lowly woman who God grants to become the bearer of God, of the Christ, of Jesus. And she glorifies God in that, even though, that's, you get stigmatized from being a virgin and having a son. And then on the other hand, you have this Pontius Pilate who is willing to save his own neck, even when his own wife tells him about this dream that she has, that Jesus is going to leave Jesus alone. And Pilate, nonetheless, for his own good, even though he knows that Jesus is righteous, lets him over to the people for the people to destroy him. So there's really this comparison between the person in the high power with all this power that God has given him, as Jesus will say to him, who abuses it and compromises his values to give up this righteous person, versus Mary. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add on to that, or anything that you think would be important for our listeners to know about Pontius Pilate just before we jump into this, but that's at least one big thing that I wanted to point out.
No, that's all good. When you said the Coptic Church, like, they focused on him a lot, did they see him as like a very negative villain character, or did they actually like him?
No, yeah, that's a good question. Actually, as we're going to see in this first one, they kind of make it look like it's not. They make every point to make it look less and less like his fault as possible. And I think I'm going to go out on a limb here. I think he might even be a canonized saint. I think it might be a little bit more broadly than that, because I think there is some tradition about him converting. But yeah, they kind of go out of their way to make him look like a better person, as we're going to see in this. So yeah, this first episode that we're going to go over, this first apocryphal gospel, is called the Acts of Pilate, but this is not to be confused with the Acts apocryphal literature that's talking about the acts of different apostles. This is all just focused in on Pilate condemning Christ, or here kind of playing a minimal part in it according to this reworking, but it's all played through that. This is not to be confused with that. And this has two parts. The first part of it is what's known as the Gospel of Nicodemus. I feel like at least that name is thrown around pretty significantly. And then the second part is called Christ's Descent into Hades. So as you can tell, I'm already kind of just predisposed to just not be a fan of the way that they kind of make Pontius Pilate a much better character than he was. But in the first text, but in the second text that was stitched together with it to become one text, Christ Descended to Hades, definitely my all-time favorite New Testament apocrypha. Very, very awesome. Very cosmic. So yeah, with that being said, this dates to, oh wait, no, I got this wrong. Okay, sorry. So this whole thing together is called the Gospel of Nicodemus. The first part is called the Acts of Pilate, and the second part is called Christ Descended to Hades. So this is the Gospel of Nicodemus. So the first of these two parts was independently written between the 400s and 600s. Ananias is supposedly the person who is collecting words written down by Nicodemus, hence the name, the Gospel of Nicodemus. Again, this is Coptic. The original language is Greek, but it claims to be Hebrew, which is interesting. In the 400s to 600s, I feel like the church in general had a thing against Hebrew. Like there were a bunch of people who were against Jerome from translating from the Hebrew and stuff. I don't know too much about that, but that's interesting nonetheless. So although it was written in the 5th or 6th century, Epiphanius refers to details found in it. So it seems that there are some traditions that are floating around long before they were written down and then edited and passed down. So Epiphanius would have lived around the 300s. So he would have lived at least about 100 years before this. So at least some of this had to have been floating around in some type of oral tradition beforehand. So legends about Pontius Pilate became very popular in the Middle Ages, and they inspired other legends about Christ's harrowing Hades, the Holy Grail, and Joseph of Arimathea, which we will get into in the second part. But with that, we're going to jump into this text. So it all begins with the Jews accusing Jesus of a lot of things. And Pilate asks how Jesus profanes the Sabbath or casts out demons if he is Beelzebub. So from the get-go, we're pulling in, the scene is opening up with Jesus standing before Pilate, and the Jews are accusing him. And Pilate is already arguing on behalf of Jesus to the Jews. So already we have Pilate kind of doing for Jesus what Jesus does in the canonical gospels, where Jesus says, how can the prince of demons cast out demons? And Pilate, there's kind of this apologetic for Pilate, where Pilate is now arguing on Christ's behalf. So Pilate asks how he can judge Jesus if Jesus is a king, and even claims it himself. Again, this is like a total makeover of in the canonical gospels, when Jesus tells Pilate boldly, like, you would have no power if it weren't that my Father had given it to you. I think that's more or less the words of Jesus to Pilate. So Pilate asks for a servant to gently bring Jesus before him. The servant puts a scarf on the ground in front of Jesus to walk on, and then calls him Lord. So Pilate is giving Jesus the red carpet treatment, bringing him over, treating him like a king. When Jesus enters to see Pilate, the royal flags with the images, there are these royal flags around him with images, and the images themselves on the flags bow down before Jesus. As much as I might not care for the other parts, that's kind of cool. Anyways, the Jews accuse the guards holding the flags of making them bow. So Pilate asks them, and they say that they are Greeks who worship the idol, so there's no reason for them to fake the bowing. And then Pilate then tests it by having Jesus enter through a second time and having multiple of the strongest guards hold the flags. Once again, they bow. Pretty crazy. I think this reminds me of when there is the Ark of the Covenant in the beginning of 1 Samuel, whenever they bring the Ark of the Covenant out to war, the Philistines capture it, it's taken into whatever temples, and all the idol of Dagon falls on his face. Dagon? Yeah, falls on his face and is defeated. So this is a kind of a cool, I mean, we've seen this in other infancy gospels as well, but still pretty cool, even if it's trying to make Pontius Pilate look quite a bit better than he really is. So right when Pilate sees the images bowing to Jesus during his test, his wife sends to him to tell him not to deal with Jesus because of her terrifying dream. And of course, that part is in the canonical gospels. So Pilate reminds the Jews that his wife is also a pious Jew, and so he should stop. But the Jews accuse Jesus of using sorcery to give her the dream. Pilate then asks why Jesus doesn't respond to the people's testimony against him. So this right here is really like the first time that we see Pilate be actually question Jesus rather than question the Jews. But other than that, so far Pilate is this pristine governor and political leader. So the Jews say Jesus was born, then the Jews accuse Jesus. They say he was born from fornication. His birth caused the death of the holy innocents, which are the children in Matthew chapter 2, I think it is, whenever Herod sends out soldiers to go and kill everyone 2 and under because he wants to kill Jesus. Those are referred to in Christian tradition as the holy innocents. So obviously they don't call them, the Jews don't call them the holy innocents, but they say that his birth caused the death of these young ones, and that Mary and Joseph fled into Egypt because they have no status. And then some pious Jews who were at Mary and Joseph's betrothal, and Lazarus is named as one of them, then denied that he was born of fornication. So we also have other characters, even though in the passion narratives in all the gospels, we see Peter going off to betray Jesus. None of the disciples are there. It doesn't seem like anyone is really there to stand up for Jesus. At least in the narrative, it doesn't make that clear. But Lazarus here is standing up for him. And then we have some other pious Jews who are there representing him. So, and another thing that's interesting about this is that here, the Jews' accusation, for example, of Jesus's birth from fornication would have more to do with a Christian's concern that Jesus actually was born from a virgin rather than an actual legal charge that therefore Jesus should be put to death, if that makes sense.
Can you re-explain that?
Yeah. So if they were going to condemn Jesus and say, look, he did something wrong, historically, practically, they would say something that Jesus himself did wrong, but rather they accuse Mary. So this could be a slight on his honor in the honor shame culture, but this couldn't be something that was used against him because he had no say in it. But there would definitely be an interest in a writer of the apocryphal gospel to make a point that Jesus actually was born from a virgin. So by the Jews accusing him of being born of fornication, that also gives an opportunity to these other pious Jews to stand up on Jesus's behalf and point out that they saw Mary and Joseph's betrothal and that he was not from fornication. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That makes sense. Would you say it's kind of similar to how, there's an apologetic for the resurrection of Jesus, being that women were the first ones to testify to Jesus's resurrection. And at the time, it looks bad that would look bad in the first century, supposedly. But then nowadays, people are like, oh, see, like they treated women with dignity and honor, or no, they were giving an accurate account. And so it looks good, today, even though back then it probably might not have looked as hot. And they're doing something kind of similar with this.
Well, I'd say it's a little bit different here in that here, there's no point for them to bring this up in a political trial with Pontius Pilate. Does that make sense? So it's almost like going out of its way to show that it's being apocryphal versus the Gospels recording that the women went to the tomb. That could make sense. That just totally makes sense that they're going and they're preparing these ointments to put on Jesus. Versus this, it's going out of its way to not even really sound all that correct. So
it's just like being very honest about how this is kind of a creative thing.
Yeah, or maybe not being honest, but it's just kind of exposing. I don't think that it's necessarily out of like an honesty thing, but it's just kind of exposing, if you really think about it, the fact that these Jews are supposedly trying to get Jesus in trouble and get crucified or whatever here. One of their accusations is that he's born of fornication and these things that have nothing to do with who he actually is. That could be a claim about why he's of lower status, like what they say throughout the Gospels, where aren't you the son of Joseph and such? Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense.
Okay, so I wanted to read this part. So this is interesting. So next, and I'm reading straight from the text. It says, "And Pilate entered into the praetorium again and called Jesus and asked him privately, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered Pilate, 'Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?' Pilate answered Jesus, 'Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?' Jesus answered, 'My kingship is not of this world. For if my kingship were of this world, my servants would fight, that I might not be handed over to the Jews. But now my kingship is not from here.' Pilate said to him, 'So you are a king?' Jesus answered him, 'You say that I am a king. For this cause I was born and have come, that everyone who is of the truth should hear my voice.' Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?'" Which is a very popular quote that Pilate says, got from, I think, from some philosopher. And Jesus answered him, "Truth is from heaven." Pilate said, "Is there not truth upon earth?" Jesus said to Pilate, "You see how those who speak the truth are judged by those who have authority on earth." So this part, there is quite a there's significantly more basis on the canonical gospels. And Pilate, again, you do have to give, as somebody who's going to make Pilate, who's ultimately going to be someone who gives Jesus over to death, you do have to have him be skeptical at the same time. So it's just interesting how they have to balance it. At the same time, Pilate is this character who's sticking up for Jesus, really, and arguing on his behalf. And yet, at the same time, they have to pull from the Gospels and come up with some reason why he still gives him over to death. So it's kind of ambivalent about Pilate and who he is, because the canonical Gospels don't really show him in a positive light. So after telling the Jewish leaders to see to it, Pilate summons the priests and Levites to tell them not to do anything because Jesus doesn't deserve death. So here's where we get that even though they had to show some part of Pilate being a little bit skeptical, even though he's sticking up for Jesus at the same time, he tells the Jews to do it. But in his defense, he told the priests and Levites to make sure nothing actually happens. I don't know. There's like a very total rewriting of the canonical Gospels here. And then Pilate asks Jesus, what should be done to him? And Jesus says, as it was given to you. And Pilate asks, how was it given? To which Jesus answers, Moses and the prophets foretold my death and resurrection. So then you have Jesus directly tell Pilate that he's supposed to be crucified, and therefore Pilate should do it. And so I wonder if this is kind of showing the whole reason why there is such a high view of Jesus here, because Pontius Pilate was playing a part in God's ultimate plan to hand him over to death. So yeah, do you want to kind of like, I don't know, do you have anything else that you wanted to add on to that? Or, because I mean, at the same time, just because something leads towards God's plan doesn't mean that God illustrated that or was acting behind that or making that happen.
Yeah, so like there's numerous times, one excellent example being the story of Habakkuk, wherein like God uses evil nations to conquer other nations. And so he's using bad guys, and the bad guys are bad. In Habakkuk, they're seen as like villainous, and it's something that the songwriter Habakkuk laments that they're coming. And so it is interesting here, right? Because you got Pontius Pilate, and the author of this is trying to present him, oh, he's someone good because he's just doing it because he's trying to fulfill whatever's happening. But, just because, something bad has to happen or something bad is going to be used by God doesn't mean that you should do it.
Yeah.
And I think there's like, it's interesting if you, at the end of Genesis, there's the phrase that gets quoted a lot where Joseph, who's had a lot of bad things happen to him, tells his brother, you meant this for evil, but God turned it for good, or something very similar to that. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, therefore, let me do evil. It's like, that doesn't really track, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, it makes sense. And, if you want to idealize Pilate, especially I can get the vibe from the book of John, reading from a certain lens. Okay, Pilate's actually a pretty good guy, or maybe like an innocent guy, a confused guy, conflicted. You can certainly see he's conflicted. And so if you just take that one step further, you're like, oh, well,
yeah,
he's just trying to go ahead and fulfill what needs to be done, right? Jesus has to die. So therefore it's good for me to go ahead and do it, which is not the best reasoning, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and with that reasoning also, Judas is almost more righteous, right? Because Judas is the one who hands Jesus over, and all of Israel is righteous because they sinned and they demonstrated that they couldn't live up to the Torah, which is like the reason Jesus needs to come, So it's kind of like it's an overshot. But yeah.
Have you heard of like those discussions? Sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but have you heard of those discussions where people debate about whether the fall was good, eating the fruit? Like
Yeah,
some people
Felix
say, well,
culpa.
is it better? Is that what it's called?
That's the name of the doctrine, Felix culpa, which means fortunate fall or happy failure, of like it was fortunate because now God could demonstrate his grace for us. Is that what you're trying to say or like point out?
Yeah, that it was good. I know some people think that, or there's discussions about that. So that's what it
Yeah,
makes
I've
me
heard
think of.
that. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that. That's interesting. And then that gets into the whole debate of like, was God going to become incarnate even if Adam and Eve had not failed? Yeah, a lot of interesting discussions that could go around that. Anyways, yeah, I kind of wanted to point out that there's a little bit of an issue with that sort of reasoning there. Not necessarily the Felix, even though I don't know, but the
That's another
reasoning that
discussion
because this is
entirely, but
part of God's plan. Yeah. Yeah. So anyways, then Nicodemus comes up and says, Jesus did all these great things that no one has ever done. He doesn't deserve death. Then the Jews say that Nicodemus was Jesus' disciple and spoke on his behalf. And Nicodemus asks, has the governor also become his disciple and speaks on his behalf? Did not Caesar appoint him to his high office? And the Jews gnash their teeth. So again, Nicodemus, who meets Jesus at night when nobody else can see him, and goes to bury Jesus after his death when no one can see him. Which there is something, but he's not the, at least in John's gospel, which is the only canonical text in which he appears, the only times he appears silently and behind the scenes. But here he's this big buff guy standing up on Jesus' behalf. And so then a bunch of healed sick people start to speak up and testify for Jesus. And then the Jews point out that Jesus healed some of them on the Sabbath, and then even tell one of them that their law doesn't allow women to testify in court. So, which is interesting, like you pointed out, that it does seem like this gospel, at least, is pointing out the scandal of women testifying to things in the ancient times. So, anyways, so the Jews tell Pilate that he is not Caesar's friend if he releases Jesus, since Jesus called himself the Son of God and King. So Pilate gets angry and tells them that they are a rebellious and seditious nation. When the Jews ask what benefactors they had rebelled against, Pilate says he heard of the Exodus story and how they made the golden calf, and Moses offered up his life to save the people. So all of a sudden, Pilate just here to remind them about their history as a nation. I don't know, a little comical.
Pilate is a faithful student of the Tanakh, right? Of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, really. He's here to remind them what they've been missing out on. Haven't you been at synagogue? Yeah. So then the Jews tell Pilate how Herod tried to kill Jesus when the wise men gave him gifts as if he was a king. Pilate asks Jesus if it's true, and he says it is. So Pilate washes his hands and once again says he's innocent of the man. Pilate then says that he will hang Jesus in the garden where he was captured next to the two thieves. Dismas, the righteous one, and Gestas, the one who will mock him. So I'm wondering if the hanging in the garden has to do with, there's like a connection to Eden, perhaps, at the best, of like Jesus is restoring Eden. But so that would be kind of cool. But yeah, then again, Pilate just totally heads him over. So then the righteous centurion who acknowledged Jesus as righteous goes to Pilate to tell him everything that happened. So in the Gospel of Mark, at least, there's one centurion, it's a Roman centurion who's watching Jesus as he's crucified, and he realizes, whoa, this truly is the Son of God. And so here he goes over, tells Pilate, hey, just so you know, he explains all the things that happened at the crucifixion, the parting of the veil in the temple, and so on and so forth, and the darkness spreading over the land. And he and his wife hear and don't eat or drink. So Pilate asks the Jews what happened, and they explain that there was just some unusual eclipse. That's it. So here, Pilate and his wife are legit fasting for Jesus as he dies after he just executed him. And he's shown to like instantly be mourning Jesus's death. Again, like to the greatest extent possible, making Pilate look better. So then the Jews search for the 11 disciples, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, after Pilate gives him his body. However, all of them hide, and only Nicodemus and Joseph are found in synagogue because they're Jewish leaders. And this is more on line with the canonical gospels, with the disciples hiding themselves in a room after Jesus is taken. So then the Jews throw Joseph of Arimathea into prison and say they will kill him and not bury him on the first day of the week, since Sabbath was coming. Joseph tells them that they talk like Goliath, but that God says vengeance is his. He refers to Pilate as uncircumcised in flesh, but circumcised in heart, and as having given them to these Jews, who says that he fears that God's wrath will be upon the children of these Jews who crucified them because of the oath that they made. And if you remember in the canonical gospels, whenever the Jews take Jesus, they say, may his, yes, can you say,
his blood be on our own hands or heads or something like that. They basically say, I'll take the ownership.
Yep. Yeah. And so then the Jews seal the door of Joseph's windowless prison. Unfortunately, that verse has come to be used to kind of argue for anti-Semitism by a lot of people, by saying that pretty much just like all Jews universally take ownership and responsibility for the death of Jesus, even though it's only those Jews who say it. And it is within their generation that the temple is destroyed and the Romans, kick out the Judeans. They go into their diaspora and such.
So you're saying, like, hypothetically, even if there was one punishment that was supposed to be for the Jews for killing Jesus, it probably would have been the destruction of the temple in the second temple in 70 AD, not like this perpetual everyone's in debt thing. And that's even if we say that that's for all Jews, which doesn't necessarily even make sense in light of the fact that several of Jesus's disciples were Jews, and clearly reading the New Testament epistles, half the church was Jews. Maybe not half, but a large portion of the church was Jews.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the destruction of the temple and the scattering of the Jews has had very long, horrendous effects on Judaism. I mean, they've just been shut up in ghettos and like persecuted everywhere. But to be fair, that's also been the case before that, just ever since the exile, really. But yeah, I think I'm going to guess that this is probably, that statement is probably a reference to the destruction of the second temple, which was like horrific. It was just a terrible event. So yeah, anyways, unfortunately, it's been taken by some Christians to say, see, look, all Jews are, and just discussing things about them. Yeah. So then the Jews go looking for Joseph of Arimathea. He's been locked up in this windowless prison. They go looking for him on the first day of the week, the Sabbath, when they weren't going to bury him, so that they can kill him. But they see that the door was opened and he was nowhere to be found. Just as Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week, so Joseph of Arimathea somehow escapes this windowless prison on the first day of the week. And he's put into the prison on the same day. So then these guards come to the Jews just after they missed Joseph of Arimathea to tell them what had happened and how they had heard Jesus' conversation with the women who came to look for his body. The Jews ask them when it was that it happened and why the guards didn't arrest the women. And the guards say that they were like dead men in fear. The Jews say, as the Lord lives, we do not believe you. And the guards say, you saw so many signs in that man, and you did not believe? And how can you believe us? You rightly swore, as the Lord lives, for he does live. We have heard that you shut up the man who asked for the body of Jesus and sealed the door, and that when you opened it, you did not find it. Therefore, give us Joseph, and we will give you Jesus. And then the Jews say Joseph went home, and the soldiers say Jesus rose from the dead. So the Jews pay the soldiers and tell them to say that the disciples stole the body. So again, pretty creative explanation for in the canonical gospels when the Jews do pay them. But I don't think it's the guards. I think it's they pay the other people, right? Or maybe they do pay the soldiers. Do you remember in the canonical gospels?
I'd like to I think it's the guards.
Okay. Yeah. So they pay the guards. And it's funny because here the guards are shown as originally even acknowledging Jesus's resurrection, and like they even heard everything that happened. So anyways, that's interesting. But they both had to have recognized it. So, it gives the explanation for that as well. So after hearing other Jews report Jesus' ascension, the chief priests and the synagogue rulers convened to ask why such a terrible sign came. Annas and Caiaphas, who are the high priests, say that the disciples gave money to the guards to lie about an angel coming down and rolling away the stone. The priests say, let it be that his disciples stole his body. But how did the soul enter again into the body so that Jesus now waits in Galilee? And they don't respond, so they just say that they don't believe the uncircumcised soldiers. So even still, you have some soldiers who are, vouching for Jesus' resurrection and really standing up to them. Then Nicodemus proposes to the council the story of Elisha. After Elijah ascended into heaven, the prophets told Elisha to search for him for 3 days, but they don't find him. So they know that Elijah was taken up. Nicodemus says that they should search for Jesus to see if he was taken up in the spirit and put on another mountain. Everyone agrees, and so they search every mountain, but they only find Joseph of Arimathea. And they don't dare to seize him, since he escaped last time. So here we have an obvious connection of Jesus' ascension with the ascension of Elijah, because after Elijah ascends, Elisha does send out, I think it's the prophets who go out to search for Elijah, and they don't find him. And this gives proof that Jesus ascended, because the Jews went out to search for Jesus' ascended body and didn't find him. So when no one could find Jesus after his ascension, the Jewish leaders write to Joseph of Arimathea, asking for forgiveness and to have a meal with him. Over a meal, they ask what happened and how he escaped. He explains that at midnight he had seen a flash of lightning and someone appeared to him. He recited the commandments and the person recited the commandments with him. He explains that this is a test because phantoms will flee when you recite the 10 commandments. Then he calls him Elijah. What was that?
Well, when it says that phantoms will flee when you recite the 10 commandments, it makes me think of like the thing, like supposedly if you put make a little cross with your hands, then it like kicks the demons out of people or whatever. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a very specific demonology pro trick if you ever see something you want to test and see if it's an angel. So then he calls him Elijah, but he says that he is Jesus. Jesus then frees him, but tells him to stay in his house for 40 days while he's with his brethren in Galilee. So Joseph of Arimathea explains this whole story while also showing why it isn't included in the canonical Gospels. The reason why Joseph being locked up and then being freed by Jesus isn't in the canonical Gospels, in case you were wondering, it's because the whole time that Jesus was ascended, Jesus told him to stay in his house for those 40 days. So, and it's an even more explicit connection between Joseph of Arimathea being freed and Jesus' resurrection. So then the Jewish leaders hear that there were some rabbis who witnessed Jesus' ascension. They get the rabbis together and interrogate them alone about his ascension. Since they all agree, they say that 3 people witnessed it, so it must be true, according to the law in Deuteronomy, that things shall be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. Then they talk about how Enoch and Moses died and no one knew what happened to them and how he was cursed for hanging on a tree. They then conclude that Jesus is the Messiah and ask for God's forgiveness and bless him and sing hymns. So this, I think, is interesting because they do kind of show Jews in a greater light than, and I think there was some pretty prevalent anti-Semitism at the time, but nonetheless, that is how the first part of the Gospel of Nicodemus ends, the Acts of Pilate. So,
can I make one really cool, interesting comment that I was thinking about? In the story of Pilate, well, they kind of like make Pilate seem like a good guy, and him and his wife are fasting and praying while Jesus is crucified, right? It made me think of the story in Daniel 6 where Darius is like really anxious about Daniel being thrown into the lion's den and kind of against his will has to give Daniel up. And so anyway, it's just similar in the sense that you've got this, I'd say bad king who he's kind of like praying for and hoping for the success of the righteous person.
Yeah, that is pretty, whoa. Yeah, that's good. The kind of typological connection. Daniel is kind of like a version of Jesus's descent into the earth and then death and resurrection. Yeah. And then they connect Darius with Pilate as well.
Yeah. Daniel, Joseph, and arguably Jesus as well, right? You have the lowly person who rises to prominence under a evil king and brings blessing to the nations. Joseph brings in blessing to Egypt by 7 years of prosperity. Daniel brings in prosperity by interpreting the king's dream, and that's Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel chapter 2, Jesus heals people, casts out demons, etc.
Whoa.
Anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting. But I mean, Darius is a different person than Nebuchadnezzar. But
So that's really interesting, because that's making me rethink about the whole thing with this type where in that instance Darius legally can't do anything to help Daniel. He kind of made a foolish decision in making the rule in the first place, but that was kind of not under his own power. So even though I would strongly disagree with the Coptics in their writing of this text, it seems like maybe that's where they got the idea that Pontius Pilate is in the same place. He can't do anything legally, even though I would disagree, because he says that Jesus is a righteous person. And so that's how they're reading him in that type.
yeah,
Perhaps.
absolutely. Well, and I think based on, I mean, it's been a second before I read the Gospel of John, but I think Pilate, you can certainly see that he feels at least partially helpless in trying to protect Jesus. He's trying to prevent the riot or whatever, compromises here. Let me give you Barnabas, but yeah.
Or Barabbas, but
not Barnabas, Barabbas.
Yeah. But it is different in that he didn't write a law that he couldn't overturn. Not that that's what you were saying, because I don't think it was. But yeah, he feels this hopelessness of like, this is the only way out. But the difference is that he really does compromise and acknowledges that Jesus is righteous, and that this other person, even though he used this other person as a point to try and get the Jews to be reasonable, he actually, knowing that what he's doing is wrong, still does it. Yeah. So overall, what orthodoxy index would you give this?
Ooh. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be making a whole lot of big theological statements, right? It's more like story. How accurate is the story? That would be kind of the statements. And so the orthodoxy index seems a little bit interesting. It almost like, I'm like, can we have a historicity index? And none of it can be proven or disproven. But to be honest, I don't really have any qualms with this one, other than maybe the issue of that Pilate was justified in killing Jesus because it seems it's like an evil thing that will turn out for good, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that might be the only one. So maybe I'll give it like a 7.
Yeah. I was going to give it an 8. That's the big thing. I mean, the early, like the Apostles' Creed points out that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. Like, it seems to be directly attributing his suffering to Pilate. I mean, even though there is, the Jewish people are the people who accused him, but it refers to Pontius Pilate. And this really does everything it can and in its power to stay orthodox. So I'd give it a passing grade, a B, but at the same time, yeah, it gives a little bit too much to Pilate. So yeah, that's the first part of this. And then next week, we're going to go over the second part, which I'm super psyched for, which is Christ's descent into Hades, my all-time favorite. So make sure that you come next week and see us in Babylonian. Until then,
It's Babylon.
Babylon.